Hello everyone, my name is Tito Chazzo and I run a design firm called X-Height Design, and today I just wanted to talk about and show an organized system when designing layout in Photoshop and what methods I use, not only mechanically but such as how to set up your file, organizational setup, but also the thought process, the design-wise I go through when I'm tackling a new project, especially for a client I've never done any work for in the past. But I'll show you a few tricks up my sleeve and such as a very cool Photoshop action set for dispersion I'll get to a little bit later. So today I'm going to walk you through this project. It's a website design I did for Datus.io. It's done through an agency I do a lot of work with and have worked for with many years in the past called Mahalo Digital, and art directed by these really cool guys over at Team Cannonball called Chris Gatewood and Andrew Schmeling. They art directed it. But this was not chosen as the final. But it's really cool. We basically had three designers that had come up with three completely different directions. This was one of them, and everybody really loved it. But it wasn't just the direction that the client at this time wanted to go. So they went through a different direction. But it was pretty cool, and I thought it would be something that I could kind of show people how I got here and a couple of really cool steps to keep in mind when designing a project like this, especially on something that might lead to other things in the future. So if you wanted to use certain aspects of it for a banner or a poster or something in print, I'll walk you through a couple of cool steps to keep those things in mind every time you're starting a new project, and you end up with something that you like and that ends up, if this one ended up being decided as the project, there were certain things that I wanted to keep in mind so that I wouldn't have to start from scratch on adding other things to it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, but this is, again, like I said, for Datus.io. They're a data management company doing everything from protection to mobilization, as well as monetizing that data. And so the direction on this particular project was keeping data moving. Data is constantly always moving. It's always traveling, going from one server, from one location to the next, and it's always something that's in a way living. It's always moving. It's always a part of everything that their clients deal with. And with this particular one, it's about, for example, if it was an audio recording, it was keeping that the media and one of their clients is in the industry, entertainment industry, and keeping their backup and their data operational and efficient. So this one, the headline is "Make sure your data doesn't miss a beat." And then we also have another, because it's part of a slideshow carousel. The other one was "Keep your data alive and let it thrive." So if they were dealing with a media company that did sports broadcasting or whatever, making sure their data was constantly backup and it was easily recoverable. So it's just all about keeping, data. Everything is data. Whether it's a text file or highly complex and compressed video file, it's always keeping the data uh, accessible and recoverable and always accessible. So that was the theme for this one. So we basically, we started out with something that was like this, which was, part of our setup and our layout, including the wireframe and what we wanted to talk about and how we wanted to organize certain things. And I won't go into all those aspects to this, because there's a lot of parts to it, and it's part of being a designer. I'm not going to tell you how to design something, but it's more of how I got to this hero shot here and how to keep the file organized. So for example, these icons here in the middle, those are all vector icons, so I don't want to bring something in as a pixel. So you basically bring in an Adobe Illustrator file and bring it in as a smart object. I don't know about smart objects and smart layers because it keeps vector objects still vector and still scalable, and it keeps rasterized images. If you have a large bitmap image like this original file, and you can scale it. So for example, these icons here, if I double click on them, they open up in Illustrator. See? So I can bring in an Illustrator, copy an Illustrator file, paste it in here. So if I did this now, if I went ahead and copied this, grabbed this file, just a simple icon for money, and I just copied it, and I wanted to bring it into Photoshop. I would just hit paste, and it asks you right here if you want to do pixels. If you're doing a vector object, never bring it as pixels. That's just pointless. Bring it as a smart object, and it keeps it as a vector object here. So all I can do is I can scale it. So you can see here I can scale it any size if I want to, and it's crisp and clean. And again, it always names your objects here, vector smart objects. So I always double click and change all these names. I don't like having any layers that have layer 1, layer 2, whatever. That just drives me insane. I'm anal retentive about layers and organizations, as you'll see here in my file. But it also works the same way when you're dealing with rasterized objects. So here is basically an image that I created, and it's basically a composite of 3 images, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the main image here, if I double click on this particular hero image here, here it is right here. I call hero 3. Actually, this should be called hero 2. I had 3 images at first, and I ended up only showing 2. So this is actually hero 2. But if I double click it, you'll see that it opens up a PSB file here, which is a large document format of Photoshop. And you'll see here it's scaled at 33%. So that, if I go to 100% on this, this is how large this is, this file. And so I wanted to do all this work here, keep everything, don't scale anything down. So you'll see this size here. It's basically 5178 by 3623. It's a fairly large document. And if you're doing something for a website comp, obviously it's going to be 72 dpi. What I wanted to do is I wanted to keep everything, so all the work that I did here wasn't wasted, so that once we put it in here, it looks great and everything. And if I decided later that they wanted to do a poster for this in print, which is 300 dpi at least, sometimes higher, I wouldn't be able to scale this up. It would just get interpolated by Photoshop. So by keeping this as a smart object, I did all my work, and then I just brought it in, and then as soon as I pasted that folder or file or layer, you could basically turn it into a smart object. So if, for example, if this particular background that I have here, which is actually not even being used on here, I won't show it to you, it's just an old image. But if I wanted here, this is a rasterized regular layer, but if I wanted to go here, I'll click on the right and you convert it to a smart object. And by doing that, if you bring it in at 100%, and make it a smart object, then you can scale it. And you can scale it up, you can scale it down, as long as you don't go past 100%. It keeps everything relative. And so all these things are kept in the Photoshop file. So if I hand this off to somebody else, I don't have to hand them a bunch of Illustrator files or a bunch of Photoshop files. Everything is contained in the original Photoshop file. I can just hand this off to him. They double click a smart layer and it opens up an Illustrator file. If it's an Illustrator file, opens up another Photoshop file if it's a Photoshop layer or document. So everything's self-contained, which is really nice, which is another reason why to kind of use smart objects and keep it really, really clean and simple and organized. But what I show you today is how I ended up creating this image, and it uses this dispersion effect you'll see on here, which is really cool. Let me turn it off so you can see what it looks like beforehand. And I did it to the microphone as well. It's this dispersion effect, which is really cool, and it's made by these guys over that they have their product on Envato Market, and it's only $6. It's really cheap, but it's really cool because it lets you do a really complicated effect, really simple, and it's basically an action set. And if you guys are familiar with these, I'm hoping that you are, because it's a quite useful tool. It's basically a set of macros, things that you can record in Photoshop and then save it as an action. And this is one that has very, very many steps in it. And so all you have to do is once you install it, and they're pretty good about showing you how to do that, and they have a couple of tutorials how to use it, just in your action panels, and there it is. It's dispersion, and you can disperse it to the right, left, top, or bottom. And you can see here this one's dispersed to the right. But I also wanted to show you not only the effect of that, but also what I did was this image is a combination of this image, which is a gorgeous shot here, this singer, and she looks like she's in trance. It's awesome, but it's really beautifully done. And the lighting's great and everything, but obviously you don't want to use the background, and so it's that image, this image, which I use for the background for the studio shot, and this particular image, which is the microphone I wanted to use. So it's the microphone. Obviously, I cloned this one out, but it's the background studio or club shot and the singer. So what I have to do for each one of these is, or at least for these two, the singer and the microphone, is to mask the background out. Now this one, it's a little bit hard because she's got all this hair here, and it's also very fine, and if you did this by hand, it would be a huge pain in the neck. You can grab your marquee tool and you start going on, and it's just, selecting everything, and it's just time consuming and tedious, and you don't even get it looking right. No matter how much you try to mask certain things out and create layer mask and use brushes, it's just really time consuming. But the cool thing is that Photoshop already has something that you can use. So select your marquee tool, either one, doesn't really matter. Make sure your layer is in a non-background layer, so just double click it and unlock it if you have to. But an unlocked layer, then you select your select menu and just select and mask. Now this starts out, and you can adjust your transparency to see how much effect that you're having. So right now, since I haven't done anything, there's nothing to see. But if I change the transparency, I get to see a decent amount of what I wanted to do, and you basically end up using more than anything else these two tools here. So this one, this top one here is your selection tool, and you basically, and this one is your refine edges, and this is your quick selection tool. And you have plus and minus. Then you can select your brush size just like you would for anything else. For something like this in the hair, I would probably want to go a little bit low, like maybe about 25 or so %. So what you start doing is, you can click on your keys, make it as large or as small. You can start selecting, and it's pretty smart on knowing what you want to grab and trying to separate your foreground from your background. So see already here, having to do anything, it's starting to really fine select her hair. And so if I go into transparency and start beefing it up, I get to see everything that I'm selecting so far. Now it does grab, obviously we need to go back in and go into that background, but because I'm using a dispersion effect here, and it's going to be hidden, oh actually I can't click until I change this, but anyways I'll show you in a second. Because I'm using a dispersion effect and all the dispersion is going to go to the right, I don't have to be too much concerned about the fine detail of getting her exact hair on here because it'll be covered up by the dispersion effect. But here in the front I will. But again, we'll lower our transparency, and you get to see all your selection. Now you would probably want to get a little bit smaller brush size when you start going through this, and you can start grabbing a little bit more than you have to. It's okay, because you can go back later and start selecting. Like look, it started connecting everything to us by going to a smaller corner of this area here. It already grabbed it, and look how well it did a job in grabbing her teeth and her lips on here. So it's really well done. So you go here, you'll see how much I already selected, and did very little work. But once you start going through this, let me go this really low so I can see the background here. So you can start seeing on here. So once you start getting through the whole aspect of it, we can go back with the refine edge tool. We could probably get this one, the hardness down a little bit, and get the spacing up, but I'm most concerned about the hardness. We can start going through the edges, and you'll start seeing on here, see it started getting rid of that gray already. It's just a fantastic job. So this is a great tool, especially for something like this, especially when it concerns hair, especially hair that's kind of frayed out like this. You get a really good job. So if I start refining the edges here, it knows what to grab, what to throw away, and what to deselect and select, which is really, really amazing. I go back here and my main one, and so anyway, so that's how I got her. It didn't take very long at all, and once you do that, you basically output it to selection usually, and so now it turns layer. I didn't grab all of her actually. So you can go into here, then you can, if you wanted to, you can go into a layer mask, reveal all, and you can fine tune it by hand if you wanted to. So for example, we can go to layer mask, reveal all. We can inverse it. This is the way I usually do it, and then So there we go. So now if I wanted to go in there and grab some more, I can go into here and basically add a little bit more to her, and you can go in there, but you know, because I didn't do enough of the select and mask tool. But anyways, so you end up with a really nice layered, a masked layer here, deselecting the background. Let me revert back to here so I don't ruin my original file. So I did that to her. Now for the other one, on this one, we obviously have to take this microphone out. I don't like it. It's a little too modern, a little too simple, and it doesn't really fit the style of the picture. So what I wanted to do is, again, turn this into a non-background layer. And so here we have two different areas. We have some really soft gradients on the left, and we have a little bit darker gradient on the right, but it's instead of having to sit there and use the stamp clone tool and start stamping everything around it, it gets really stampy looking. It just starts getting all the edges no matter how fine-tuned you are. But a really cool little trick that I've done in the past, especially on something like this where you got a blurred gradient background type of coloring, I can grab a chunk of the left side. We don't want to grab the microphone, we just want to grab the background. And let's grab a little bit less of that handle. And we don't want to grab this guy's shoulder, so we'll clamp it off here. Grab a little bit of less of that blurredness on his head. So here you have a nice soft gradient. You have a little bit of that blue on top. We don't have to worry about that right now, because there's enough room here between the microphone and the top. So what you want to do is you want to copy that, paste it, and it'll paste it right on top. You want to go transform scale, and what we want to do is we want to move the center point all the way to the left. So instead of really scaling it, we're basically stretching it, and we're moving it to the right. So what I'll do is I'll show you here. So we'll move it a little bit further more than center, and I'll tell you why in a minute. We'll do there. So there's a pretty decent cover up. We can fine tune the edges here and everything, so that does a lot of work for you. And do the same thing for the right now. So for the right, we want to grab again a chunk of this gradient on the right hand side. Now we don't want to grab this guy's head and distort it, because then it will look pretty obvious to what we're doing. So we basically deselect that, and now we have let's not get too close to the edge here. Now we have a decent gradient here on the right that we want to use for cover up. So again, once it's selected, copy it, paste it. Now we have another layer here. You can't tell because it's right on top, but again we go to transform and scale, and now we move the center point to the right. And again, we're not really scaling as much as really just stretching it. So we'll stretch it and we'll move it a little bit past here, the center. So you know, with a little bit of touch up left, left and right, top and bottom, we have in just a couple of matter of seconds we have a cover up here. And so what you can do is, again, you can add a layer mask to this one here, and we'll start just with the brush tool here. I'll set my hardness down to pretty much nothing, a really super soft brush. Increase the brush size a little bit, and now we can start getting rid of this. Excuse me. Got to make sure that your mask colors, it's always black or white, make sure that you're using the right color. So now we can start slowly, and again this is set it to 100. We can kind of change this opacity, but you can basically, and then you can create a soft blend between the left and the right. You can start getting rid of the top as well, because we don't need as much. Again, we can do it to the right as well, but you can start seeing how just in a matter of seconds we can have a left side. We do the same to the right, and then yes, when we get to the bottom on this area here, we'll basically, yes, we'll have to start doing some fine-tune cloning and using the clone stamp. But again, you can also do things like this. If we get to the bottom, we can start grabbing certain areas like this, copying, pasting, stretching, and doing the same thing. So you do this like just 3 or 4 times on here, erase certain types of the edges, help them blend better, and blend the 2 layers together, and in a really short period of time you'll have a really soft cloned out area. And I'll show you in a second here what the end up product looking like. So and this layer here is my smart layer, and it has everything separated into parts, and I'll go into exactly how I'll go to the dispersion in a second. But I'm going to get rid of her. Excuse me, it's the woman and the singer. So I'll get rid of her, get rid of the microphone, the colorizing on here, and then also the dispersion on there. Circle design, and we'll get rid of, we'll get rid of the microphone part. So this is what I ended up with in my background image here. So we're talking about the cloning part. And I did a couple of darkness on here, and you'll see that later on, because on my original comp I wanted some darkness to have on this edge around her hair and everything. I wanted to make it a little bit more natural. But it didn't take me long at all to get this end product. And basically, you start seeing I start grabbing some lightness on here because it's a little too dark, and I just started using some brushing. I needed to get rid of that spotlight on the top right because it was too distracting for the layout, and especially with this menus at the top. But it just looks a lot more natural. And then I get certain parts on here where I basically just grabbed a couple of things. Like I grabbed this light, stretched it, put it in the corner. Especially with a blurred background like this, it doesn't take much effort at all. So this is what, excuse me, let me get back to it. Let me go back to my original file here. So basically, this is the final layered document that I ended up putting into my layered website comp. But what I did was I started out with this is my file, and I'll tell you how I ended up doing the dispersion. In the dispersion file, they'll tell you how to use it, but you'll see on here I have one layer which is a composite. Basically, it's everything put together, pre-dispersion effect, and then I applied my dispersion effects. And the reason why is because when you do a dispersion effect, it basically you'll see on here, it grabs elements that are all around it, even though it's the area that you selected to basically quote unquote be dispersed. It grabs certain elements that are around it. So if you have a background, and the way the dispersion works, by the way, you can't use it on a semi-transparent layer. It has to be a locked background layer. It's just the way that the action set works. So that's why you had to have basically a flattened version first. Even though I have a file here with her all layered out and all basically separated, I created one file with all this layering, basically, saved it, and saved a version of it that's basically the same exact dimensions, but it just flattened. And then I took that flattened one and created the dispersion effects, and then that way I can just basically transfer the dispersion effects into this one. So what I ended up doing was I had all this with parts basically on here. Let me get this one with the microphone. And so I ended up with the layer document like this with no dispersion to it. Flattened it, saved that copy of it into another file, and then that's where I basically put in my dispersion effects, because as I said earlier, basically it grabs elements that are around it. It has to be a locked, flattened background layer that it does the effect to. So I can't use that dispersion effect on, like, say, on the singer, which is basically a masked layer. And then I wanted to have the effect like it was, take into account all the background and the colorization and the gray that it has in there. And you can see on here when it basically blurs stuff, it has certain amounts of that gray background in it. And so what I did was I had this layer here, flattened it like I said, did the dispersion effect, and then once the dispersion effects takes effect, it basically creates all these layers and these folders, and you'll see on here the dispersion is quite a bit of parts. You'll see on here, look up, it's got quite a bit of parts. But all I did was, once I did the dispersion effect, it was basically transfer those dispersion effects, copy those particular folders into this file. So and that's why I have, like I said, I have this background layer that basically is just a flattened version of it. And then so the website where I bought this explains to you really well how to use it, but I'll go through it here just real quickly, and how to do it. So once you have this flattened layer, so let's basically take this. Let's just take this, take all the dispersion effect out. So here's my flattened version, right? So it's just this. It has to be background, like it was just a flattened background layer, locked. You create a new layer, you call it mask, all lowercase. That's important. Let's get a color here that's pretty bright and vibrant so we can see what we're working with. Select your brush tool. Now it doesn't have to be completely hard or completely soft on the brush. It could be a combination depending on how much you want to grab. I think on this one it was only about maybe about 20% if I can remember correctly. But the opacity, you want to, at least for the immediate edges, you want to keep those at 100%. So you could basically start grabbing, painting. You can change the size of it, how much you want to grab, and then just start going through the edges like this. You don't have to be too exact, because again, it is going to be this soft effect on as far as the edges are concerned, and it's going to create this dispersion effect going in there. But I also wanted to do it on our headphones, and I wanted to grab a little bit of that on there. So you basically do something like that, refine it as much as you want. And I did a separate one for the microphone as well. And now, you basically just do one for the singer, revert back once you transfer over your copied folders, and then do the same thing for the microphone. So once you do that, you go into your actions. Once you install your dispersion effect, and I want it to disperse to the right. So you select your mask layer that you did the painting on. No other layers really need to be up. And then you hit play. Shoot, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can fix this. The command select. Oh, that's making sure. Oh, one of the things that you want to make sure is under your panel options that you had the add copy is basically selected. Otherwise, the dispersion won't work. Oops, I said mask. It should be called brush. Excuse me. So in other words, that layer needs to be called brush, that you're doing the effect that you want to go in. Again, the website explains this in better detail than I am, but I'm just doing a really quick walkthrough. So I selected right, I hit play. Now this takes a while, so I'm going to pause the video because it does take a minute or two, and I'll get back to you once the effect happens. Okay, so the dispersion effect is now complete. Now you'll see that it makes it quite dark, because it does add a couple of different effects and contrast and saturation and so forth. So right now you can see it's got a saturation stuff. It adds a contrast, which you can change the opacity. This one I basically kept it pretty low, just add a little bit for the edges of the dispersion. But you see what I'm saying about the background. So you'll see here it adds all this kind of gray. And the cool thing is that it does add. It basically creates a folder called dispersion, and then two other adjustment layers. One called saturation and adding contrast. But it does include, it does add these layer mask folders. Layer mask. So you can basically, if you wanted to, you can get rid of it. Like it adds all this gray to her hair or to her face, and adds too much dispersion up here at the top. And you can change it. Now it didn't add enough to me, so no matter how much I get to the edges, it didn't do it. So the cool thing is that I unlock that so it keeps that separate. So I select this, and I can actually grab the entire folder, and let me change the center point a little bit over here, and I can actually just move these dispersions a little bit more to the right and play around with it a little bit, and do all kinds of really cool effects to it. But you'll see on here that it basically does. It grabs, since it grabs part of that background. You can, again, like I said, you can mask some of that out if you wanted to. You can, leave a couple of dispersion effects in there if you want. I don't like it going at the top. I want to make it seem like it's more flowing to the back. But anyways, you get the idea. It basically separates that. So now that I have all these folders, I can just basically transfer I can create all this. That's what I did is I kind of grabbed all three of these, grouped them together into one thing called, basically called this dispersion. I'll say woman, and then I can just basically duplicate this group, and I can add it to my my layer 1 PSB if I wanted to, or whatever I had called. So I can basically just transfer this over, and now that's what I end up with this. So I ended up with this file that basically has everything separated, that has the woman separated, the background separated, the microphone separated, but also adds all the dispersion effects to it as well. And then I can control them and do what I want with them. But it's really, really cool, and I really like the effect that it does. And so, for example, in this one, so that's another version of the studio that I basically had to change. But the really cool thing is also that I did the same exact effect to the microphone, but the original microphone had a couple of things in there I wanted to change. One of them was the colorization on that microphone. It's a little too orange. I wanted to basically reflect the color tones on this to be a little bit more like it's reflecting the colored light that's coming off of her. So if I left it as it was originally, it was just a little too orange, and the color wasn't quite right compared to her. So I wanted to add that to it. I also had a little bit of a motion blur to the microphone, like it's actually coming out. And just a couple of minor tunes, but that's basically it. So I basically have this nice final file. I basically copied everything and then pasted in here, and then just turned it into a smart layer. So now if I show you on here in this middle one, the really good pro side of using this, if I wanted to scale this up, since it's a smart layer, if I scale this way up, as long as I'm not going past the original size, which is like 5,000 or something, this one's only about 2,200 or so, you see that it's still clean. I mean, it's not interpolated at all. I can even go higher if I wanted to. I can, again, I can scale this up as much as I want to, as long as I don't go past the 100% size. So you can scale it up, and do what you want with it, and it's still 100%. So it's just a really cool way and effective using this. And another thing too was that this is actually sitting on one single artboard, and when you're doing stuff like for website comps, it's really important to use artboards, because some people find them as being of a pain, but in the old days, before you had artboards, you had to put everything in constant layers, and then if you had different web pages that were different sizes for different heights, for example, some web pages much taller than others, you had to crop them and export them and not save it. It's just a huge pain in the ass. But now, if you had artboards, it makes it so much easier, especially when you're moving things around and changing the canvas size. For this one, again, this is just a single home page, so I only have one artboard page, but here's another project I did for another client, and it have all these various artboards. And so you have all these basically canvas folders, or not really folders, but they're artboards. And you see as I click on them, different artboards selected. But they're all different sizes. And the cool thing is that you can change the canvas size. So if I went to this particular service page here, it tells you here's your artboard property. I can actually make this, let's say if I want to make this a little bit taller, I can just change it, and you don't have to sit there and go to canvas size and everything else. So it's a really nice way of doing this. And the really cool thing too is just that if you're moving things, let's say for example I'm doing these buttons, right? One of them is client registration, the other is agency registration, and I have to move them from one artboard to another. Once I create one for one artboard, I have to put them on there. And the great thing is that here you have these different canvases, and so if I'm copying, let's say for example, this is artboard services 1, artboard services 2. So if I'm going to artboard 1 to artboard 2, and let's say for example I don't have these buttons, excuse me, not this one, let's say for the second one I don't have those buttons, and I haven't created them yet. So I'll go into these two buttons here, I'll duplicate them, and so I'll duplicate these two buttons, and then when I move them to another artboard, so here's the duplicates of it, and now I want to put them to this artboard, instead of having to bring in my rulers and my guides and find out exactly where it's centered, just by putting them and the center points are the same. I can actually just grab these duplicated ones, put them in here, and there they are, and it puts them exactly in the same spot. So that's just the beauty of artboards. They're really, really a big plus, especially when I'm doing website comps. It just comes in extremely handy for doing stuff. And once I started using them, I really haven't stopped. And even for something like this, for a single page document, I just get into the habit of creating a single artboard, because I know that later, if this particular design was approved, I would be creating the other pages, and I can just keep this one document and just keep on adding artboards. And if you ever done website comps, you know they use a lot of the same, your menus and certain types of things that you're constantly using for the various sections. I can just sit there and duplicate them, and not having to worry about the placement of it. I can just copy it, duplicate them, and put them in the next artboard, and it puts them in the same exact spot as the original. So anyways, before I go, I wanted to kind of show you also another benefit about keeping a hero image like this that you create and keep it in its separate layers, which is the great thing about having a smart object, is that it contains all the layers that you want, like in this one. So basically what I wanted to do was, if I wanted to make this since this is a website and I wanted to make a mobile version, so let's go to, if I go to my artboard, instead of 1200 pixels wide, let's see if I make this more like around 700 or 680, somewhere around there. And I wanted to have some flexibility in my hero image. Obviously the text, I can change that. Obviously I can go ahead and scale that, or change the layout of my text. If I can move it around, I can do all kinds of things, do a logo, whatever. So let's just say for example, but her and the microphone are taking up too much space, say. So what I could do is, if I could go into my original layer document, obviously I'll save a different version of it for the mobile, but for this purpose I'll just leave the original as it is. So I'll grab the elements that I want to scale, which would be the woman, the microphone, the circle, and then dispersion effects thereof. But I wanted to say I wanted to leave the background as is. So I'll go ahead and I'll scale those objects. So here I am scaling it down, making it a little bit smaller. I could also, if I wanted to, I could also change the distance of how close or how far she is away from the microphone. Certain things like that. But say if I wanted to kind of scale things up. So let's say if I do that and save this, and once that gets saved, my original document will update. So here it is, Photoshop doing a little bit of thinking, and now it's up. You can see here it's updating the smart objects. So there she's scaled. She's probably scaled a little bit too low, but anyways, you get the idea. So therefore, by keeping everything separate, keeping everything in layers, never flattening it really, it gives me a lot of flexibility on doing something like this. And you could also do really cool things, like if you wanted to create a parallax view between the background and the foreground. So if someone scrolls down, the background will scale at a different speed than the foreground, which is the singer and the microphone. And it gives you all kinds of really cool effects that you can do just by keeping everything separate. And it gives you so much more tools at your disposal when you keep everything separate. So anyways, thanks for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave comments, and since it's my first video, hopefully I'll be able to do more later on. Bye bye.